Talk or Spot. I'm Dulce Zara and I will be the host today. Our discussion will focus on the prospects for outbound migration and remittance inflows to Asia and the Pacific. We are lucky for our guests today will share the findings of their studies. One done by the International Organization for Migration, and another is a forthcoming policy brief from ADB. Before I introduce them to you, let us first take a look at this video.
Hold a sec.
This time on Expert Answers, we've got the latest figures on remittances. Now, you'll remember that these are those vital flows that migrants send back to their home countries, to their friends and their family, and they were predicted to fall dramatically during the pandemic. So how did they fare? I recently caught up with the World Bank's Dilip Ratha to get the latest figures and hear what role remittances play in the COVID-19 response and recovery. Well, Dilip, welcome back to Expert Answers. I know you have a new report out, you have some new research that you're going to share with us, but before we get into that, in the past we've talked about the important role that remittances play in international development, eclipsing FDI and overseas aid. Talk to me a little bit about the role, just kind of broadly, that remittances play in the COVID-19 response and recovery.
Thank you, Paul. It's nice to be back. Remittances were truly helping a lot of poor people get out of poverty, buy basic necessities like food, and pay for hospitals and children's education. And during the COVID crisis, of course, the need for such help was even stronger. This is an important point to emphasize that if there is a natural disaster, if there is a financial crisis, if there is an earthquake or a hurricane, including the one in Honduras last year, or if there is a pandemic like the COVID-19, before any other kind of form of help, it is the family members themselves that help out, and the neighbors and friends who help out. In this case, the family members who are abroad, the migrants, it is not just a big flow that helps big countries or small countries. It actually is a flow that serves as a financial lifeline to many households.
We were predicting that remittances were going to fall somewhere between 14 and 20%. You have some new figures out showing a much more positive picture. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're finding here in this latest report?
So we were expecting last year that remittance flows would fall by about 20%, and then later on we revised that up to say that no, actually there'll be a fall of about 7% in 2020. Now, with data in hand, in 2020, latest data shows that remittances held up very well to $540 billion, a fall of only $8 billion. That's a fall of 1.6% only. And going forward, there is an expectation that they would increase by about 2.6%, a little more than 2% in the next years. So in the second quarter last year, and definitely in the month of April, everything came to a standstill. And even people couldn't send money home, even if they had the money, because money transfer operators were not there, and there were travel bans, and there were social distancing requirements. People just couldn't go out to send money. That changed significantly in the months afterwards. So June, July, August, so third quarter, and definitely the fourth quarter of last year, flows of remittances to poor countries recovered significantly. And the surprise element to us was that the world was more prepared for remote work and to send money through mobile money, mobile phones, internet-based money, digital money. The world was more prepared for digital solutions to what in the beginning was a tangible thing of one having to go to a store and then send money. So that was one big surprise. The second big surprise was the counter-cyclical policies, the fiscal support policies, stimulus policies, employment support policies that many of the large host countries put in place, and the size of those fiscal stimulus packages. And that propped up.
Explain that to us.
Dulce, I'll cut the slides. Okay. Back to you, Dulce.
Thank you so much, James. So joining me in the panel are the authors of the forthcoming policy brief, starting with Aiko Kikawa, an economist from ADB's Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department, Guntur Sugiyarto, a principal economist from Central West Department, James Villafuerte, a senior economist from the Southeast Asia Department, and lastly, Jonathan Capel, a director of the Asia Pacific region of the Developing Markets Associates. He is the lead author of the IOM study. So I encourage everyone to post their questions on the chat box while we're having the discussion. So earlier we have seen a global perspective in the video. Let me run through some statistics on Asia and Pacific this time. In 2019, Asia was the largest receiving region in the world, with about $325 billion in formal remittances, or about 45% of global flows. This is according to the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development. Now, according to the latest IOM report, by mid-2020, 83 million people, or 30% of the world's international migrant stock, came from the region, with most of them coming from South and Southeast Asia. Women comprised 44% of the immigrants last year, and about 73%, or close to 31 million of the international immigrants aged 20 to 64 years last year. So now let's turn to Aiko. Aiko, can you tell us the impacts of COVID-19 on the movement, employment, and well-being of international migrants from Asia and the Pacific? And what are the near-term prospects for outbound migration from the region? You're on mute, Aiko. Sorry.
Okay, now it's okay. Sorry, I thought I had unmuted. Okay, so thank you very much for inviting me to this talk, and also to touch upon a little bit of our policy brief that is hoping to come out by end of this year. So I think since we had about 2 years of, close to 2 years of time in COVID, a lot of things happened, and that many of what happened at the earliest part of the COVID has been discussed in our earlier papers or brief. So maybe I can talk a little bit about maybe what happened this year and what would happen following. So as everyone knows, in terms of the movement, there was a massive return of workers that took place at the onset of the outbreak of COVID. And then thereafter, there was a strict movement restriction that disallow migrants, even with a contract, to be deployed to the overseas destinations. And this sort of inability to go to the destination is very much detrimental to the type of migration that is starting from Asia, which tend to be temporary, or that which is having a bounded contract, and more towards the Central Asia and also in the Pacific, seasonal. So there will be a lot of movement already coming back and forth, but once it's halted, people are not able to go. This can be, for example, contrasted to the situation of immigrant, where most of the people settle there. So it doesn't. It would not require a lot of movement to be continued to work. So our report, which is forthcoming, shows that in terms of the deployment for 2020, there was a contraction of deployment from, as far as the country that we know have a data, about 60 to 70% reduction of the people going for overseas work, either as a new contract or rehire contract. So that's a very significant decline. And for 2021, we have seen a recovery of this movement of labor migrant workers to some extent, but this varies quite a lot by destinations and occupations. So we have seen some pilot of the movement of workers being disembargoed, and they would have like agricultural workforce, some of the urgently needed priority sectors. Government have started the pilot of starting to allow workers, or those who had work permit, they're given a longer term visa so that they can stay without returning. So we would see in the upcoming brief that for some countries such as Bangladesh, we have seen some good recovery in terms of the deployment, whereas other countries such as Indonesia, which have been still facing long-lasting ban from many of the destinations, would continue to suffer. And these would have implication, of course, on the remittances. So maybe just a small note on then what we would see in the near-term prospect and mobility within this region. I think the situation has come to the point where more governments are able to be a little bit more agile and flexible in terms of when to close, when to open, and that people will be able to, and that the distance have become shorter, so that people might be having more chance to be able to depart when conditions are better and can wait and go. So this kind of trial and error is now taking place, and we would expect to see more movement in the while. However, there's a big issue about the health protocol. So even before COVID, we have seen that a destination country has been very picky on the health requirement. They would, typically say that you have to get your TB screening from XX locations, not from any of the general hospital. They're very strict in terms of the kind of certificate or the qualification that is needed to get the visa or the employment. So how does it come into the COVID and people having different, vaccine brand to vaccine coverage? This would continue to be an issue. Then we have to monitor it very closely, and this also, encourage our effort to bring more vaccines to the countries of origin of migrant. Thank you. You're on mute.
Dulce, you're muted.
Okay, thanks a lot, Aiko. So that's an overview of some of the findings from the report, from the policy brief. Now, can we ask John, what about your findings based on the IOM study? What have been the impacts of COVID-19? Thank you.
Just on mute there. Yeah, so basically, again, sort of prefacing this, that this study is mainly focused on 2020 and some remittances coming in just into the beginning of this year. What we found was, and I think this was supported by the interview we had earlier, referencing a lot of the public sector policies that were and fiscal responses that took place. This tended to have a very I guess gave a very big boost to remittance flows, and we saw so for example, if we're looking at Bangladesh, we saw that actually remittances were over 40% higher than the expected 22% decline that they were expecting in 2020. And then looking, I mean, bearing in mind the studies across 12 countries, it can obviously be a little bit difficult for me to go through everything now, but if I sort of give you, the Pacific, the what we saw was remittances holding up very well, in fact increasing in Fiji, with huge growth in mobile remittances. There was such a sort of profound impact in the first lockdown where there was in Australia and New Zealand basically nowhere that you could send cash for a period. So this helped to accelerate and also mobile inflows coming in from elsewhere around the world. I think looking at those two countries and generally developed economies in general, the furlough schemes and the other kind of policy initiatives from governments helped to ensure that migrants were retained in employment. and able to continue supporting their families. It wasn't necessarily a positive story elsewhere. Like Indonesia, for example, had some had less positive reports. Inflows actually fell significantly last year. Of course, Indonesia also was impacted by a higher death toll than other countries in that first wave in 2020. So, and just for looking at another example here. So, see with Philippines, of course, as you know, there was some, there was a number of government interventions that helped to alleviate and kind of limit the plunge in remittance flows. So the BSP was very active in a number of areas, and that really helped to either ensure that remittance fees could be waived for Filipino migrants, or there was actually relief measures that took place that helped the payment system within the country, so that helped to sort of reduce the impact on the bank. So the Phil Pass fee waiving, which I believe is now extended through to the end of 2021. I guess just looking at a little bit outside of that study and looking at the some other insights that we've had recently. So we recently worked with IOM Lao, and that was a study looking at the socio-economic impacts of COVID-19 on migrant workers in Laos. And this took place very much against the shadow of the Delta wave. So there was huge amounts of returning migrants coming back into Laos. People who perhaps had spare capacity the previous year, had more money available. They were, basically coming back with everything they had. They were, in some instances, people were reporting that they were sort of basically taking loans to ensure that they could support their families back home, with, of course, no guarantee that they had work to go back to when they got to Laos. So this, I think this, while this was just focused on Laos, I think that it sort of suggests the sort of broader impact there. And I think the recent Nomad report that's just come out also seems to underline the significant fall in migrant stocks, particularly in places like the Gulf states, for example, which, of course, is going to have a much more dramatic impact in 2021 on remittance inflows. Okay. You're Dulce. You're
muted, Dulce.
Okay, getting used to this. Thanks for mentioning about the case in Laos. I read that, in the case of the Greater Mekong sub-region, especially in Thailand, it has experienced 18% decline in registered workers. So I guess, coming from its neighboring countries. So not only Laos, but Myanmar, Vietnam, in Cambodia as well. Now, let's go to the impact of the COVID-19 on remittances. John has touched on some, but based on your studies, Aiko, what can you share with us regarding the impacts of COVID-19 on remittance inflows? And what do you think are the main hurdles or challenges to remittance inflows?
Thank you. Perhaps on the the prospect side, James could discuss a little bit more, but maybe I could talk about more from the household side. So, for example, we have analyzed the data of remittance inflows to Bangladesh household for the first year of the COVID, and found that about 40% of the recipient household claim that they have experienced the stop of the remittance at some period, 3 months. And many have also reported the return of workers because of the termination. So while remittance are known to protect the families from the risks, those vital line itself can also stop in the time of pandemic, and that those have to be known. And another finding from that really shows the dear state of the household that receives remittance is that we tend to see the macro inflow as something that represents potential impact on household, but our data shows that while macro inflow will be recovering, that that the recovery rate that is experienced at the household levels are much slower. And also, they would be receiving more volatility than what the macro data shows. So that when we think about the kind of impact that households are feeling, there's a danger of us just looking at the macro figure and say, oh, it's recovering, must be looking good. No, I think better household type of data examination is needed to tell us what kind of conditions they are. I don't have the data yet, and hope we can find out a little bit more, is that these migrant households, because they're usually not in the a category of the poor, because they have been receiving substantial amount of remittances in many cases. However, once that stopped, it could really fall into a very critical level. But since they have not received social transfer in the past and not in the registry, and that most of the country have used this existing registry to transfer different cash and so on, because they cannot go around and knock the door to ask the status because of the mobility restrictions. We have some certain concern that these households are left out of some of the support and trying to seek for their own means. We're just looking at the data to see if those stories are true, but some of the migrant households, especially the one without access to income, like old age household, might have a substantial blow from such a remittance cut.
You're muted, Dulce.
Sorry about that. Turning over to James. I get so excited, I just want to find out, so you have some estimations on, what would be the prospects for remittances this year and next year. Can you share with us, like, the method used in shaping up the paper? Thank you.
Thank you, Dulce. As Aiko mentioned, this is actually a second study on migration and remittances. The first one done in August 2020. There, our estimate is that global remittance would fall by around 9.7% in 2020, and remittance for Asia Pacific would fall by around 11.5%. And lo and behold, we were out by so much. Global remittance only fell 2.4%, and Asia Pacific fell by 2%. And let me explain a bit why. Because this is really not a forecasting, but a scenario analysis. The model that we use is actually the bilateral global migration model of GTAP or GMIG, and it uses the GTAP 10A database. So basically, if you look at that model is a macroeconomic model that looks at remittances as a fixed proportion of income earned by foreign workers. Now, what determines foreign workers is basically the wage differential between sending and destination, origin countries and destination countries. So therefore, what that estimation would capture are actually just changes in the wages. But as what we saw in 2020, there are many factors that explain the robust outcome for remittances. One is some of the migrant workers that came back, especially, for example, in South Asia, we have lots of evidence that came back because they were displaced from the destination economies, brought back some of their savings assets that they've accumulated over the years. Second, as mentioned by the World Bank report, the stimulus also benefited a lot of these migrant workers, and the model does not actually account for the impact of stimulus. And third is the cultural aspect of altruism. When migrant workers realize that their family are actually facing a huge health and economic shocks, their propensity to send back was actually much stronger. And last but not the least, I think there were also movement in terms of the digital aspect, which made them easier to send money. So I think that's what we learned from the first study. Now this study is actually an update of the 2020 study. And what we are seeing is actually a very strong recovery from 2020. So for 2021, our expectation is that global remittances would recover by 4.8%. And in 2022, it will recover by about 4.2%. If you compare this with the global growth recovery, this is actually a little bit slower than the GDP growth recovery because in the economic scenario that we're using, global growth in 2021 is bouncing back to 5.3%. And for 2022 is bouncing back by 4.2%. So roughly around 90% of output elasticity is captured by the bounce back in remittances. Now, if you go to Asia, our expectation is from the -2% decline in 2020, remittances to Asia and the Pacific will actually bounce back by 6.7%, which is actually much stronger than the economic recovery of GDP. And for 2022, our remittances would grow by 5.9%. Although if you look at Asia by sub-region, the performance varies a lot. So the leading sub-region actually is still India, South Asia, in particular led by India. For South Asia, we expect remittances to recover by 9.4% in 2021 and 7.2% in 2022. And these are actually large growth recovery. Even if you compare this estimate from the available data, high-frequency data up to September, what our expectation actually is the actual outcome might actually be stronger than what we are seeing, because our scenario is actually assuming a very pessimistic economic condition where the emergence of the Delta variant actually continues up to the middle of 2022. So mind you, these projections are actually underestimate. But as I said, the diversity, so if you look at, for example, Southeast Asia, the bounce back of remittances in Southeast Asia is much more muted at 4% in 2021 and 5.9% in 2022. And there are sub-regions like, for example, the Pacific, which will remain to contract, remittances will remain to contract in 2021. And for example, for Central Asia, the recovery of remittances in Central Asia in 2021 is only 1%. So there's a bit of diversity. Now, if you compare this projection to the no-COVID baseline, what I would want to emphasize is that despite this massive recovery, the level of remittance compared to the no-COVID baseline is way, way below. So for example, if you compare it to the no-COVID baseline, I think the level of remittance is about 16.3% lower for about 25 of the economies where the data for remittances is available. So despite this bounce back, what we're seeing is that the level is still 1/8 of the level that should have been there without COVID. So let me stop from here for now. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Now, I'm just wondering if you got the chance to take a look at the impact on GDP, particularly on those countries that are heavily dependent on remittances. Maybe we can turn to Aiko on this.
Thank you. So in terms of the country-specific projection, we would not have it in our own projections. But what we can say from our previous understanding is that, for example, country in Central Asia, which would continue to experience some more, slower recovery of the remittance, these are the countries plus Pacific, some of the high remittance dependent, both in terms of to the GDP and also the share of the household which would receive remittances. For example, in Tajikistan, almost a majority of the household have been receiving remittances, and quite heavily so. For countries like Samoa, I think majority, over 60, 70% percentage of household receive it, but at lesser margin of income. So there's a variety to that, but we were particularly concerned about the country that for the household that has income highly dependent on remittances. Not having that or having a reduction of that can affect quality of life, the education for the children, and so on. So countries that involves moderate or slow recovery of remittance include countries like Tajikistan, to some extent Uzbekistan. Those countries might have a little bit more time of difficulty before going back. And for the Pacific, as John said, it has available data suggests some recovery. However, the remittance data for Pacific remains highly volatile, and that because of a lot of the cutoff of the remittance transfer channel because of the de-risking behaviors of the major bank from the US and others, the data is highly unreliable. So we still struggle to really get what is happening on the ground or the extent of the receipt from household.
Thank you, Aiko. At this point, I'd like to invite anyone from the audience. If they have questions, please feel free to type or raise your hand.
Dulce, maybe you also want to invite Guntur to say something first.
Yes, I'm going to Guntur in a
Okay.
while. I haven't forgotten you, Guntur. Don't worry. Okay, so no questions at this moment. Yes, let's find out how governments are responding to the situation, especially now that many governments are finding out when is the right time to cut down on the stimulus, if ever. So, Guntur, can you share with us how the governments in the region are supporting migrant workers and remittance inflows? And if you can share any good lessons or good policies that can strengthen outbound migration and remittance inflows from the countries? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Roger. Before answering directly to your question, I would like to add one kind of critical point from the one that already kind of mentioned by James, by Aiko, and by John. This is regarding the comparison between remittance and migration impacts of the COVID. Yeah. Actually, from the previous experience, we know that the impact on remittance going to be much less, and then but the impact on the kind of real sector, on the flows of migration, that could be kind of stronger. This is first aspect. Second, and the impact, the long-lasting impact on the real sector could be longer than the financial sector. So we can observe later on, for instance, that the remittance can still increase despite the flows on the stock of migration actually decline. So this is the kind of phenomenon that we already observed before too. So this is the first kind of notion that we must kind of bear in our mind when we are looking at this issue. Why? Because from the previous work that we did with IOM on the global financial crisis, in addition to altruism that James mentioned, there is also kind of bonded commitment among the migrant workers. So even if the migrant workers kind of lost their job, they still need to send kind of the commitment kind of money back home for financing the education, for financing the healthcare, all of those things. They can send that from their saving, from borrowing, and there are so many coping mechanisms that we observed during the global financial crisis. And then this first. Second, why remittance kind of inflow keep coming despite all of those things? This is because during the crisis, during the counter-cyclical nature of the remittance, actually not only workers sending remittance home. Many of the remittance actually coming from non-workers, non-migrant workers in outside. So people who already reside outside, which no longer kind of migrant, they already resident of developed countries on those things. During this crisis, they also send back home money. And by statistic, this money, this new money coming from non-residents is also considered as remittance. So that's the reason. I think John highlighted that we observe now that the remittance impact, the remittance inflow impact is very small, despite we kind of see a lot of changing in the migrant stocks in Middle East, and also from some countries like from Indonesia, for instance, which is kind of very striking. Yeah. So that's the first point that I would like to add on the things. And then on the government response, this is very interesting questions. And to be honest with you, I need to put my point first forward. So far, the response from the government of sending country is always disappointing. If you look at the evidence across the kind of region, most of the refacilitation of migrants to re-enter the kind of workforce actually coming from the host countries. Like in the UK, for instance, they provide some special facilities to bring in some kind of workers in critical sectors. The same like Australia, the same from other countries. But during this period, we didn't see that the government of sending countries negotiating specific terms for their migrant workers in the destination country. So there's kind of asymmetric response, good response in that sense. Well, actually, if we look at the situation now, ideally there should be some kind of concerted effort, some coordinated effort at different levels. There should be some kind of action at global, there should be some action at regional, and there should be some action at country-specific level. So that's the idealistic situation given the problems now. But we don't see that. We saw more the response is actually coming from the host country. So this is give us some kind of a disappointment response, if you may say like that, from both sending and receiving countries. I hope this is long hope actually. This already long issues that we already highlighted before, that the government of sending countries nowadays should be much more proactive in helping their migrant workers. Why? Because migrant and remittance now is already part of the global agenda already and the SDG. So the political kind of issue, the political dimension of migration should not be an issue anymore. So we should be openly discuss about migration across countries, because the reality is that we cannot avoid migration. You can see now if you go to Dubai, like what I did last week or so, you already see some kind of foreign workers already working in Dubai airport in kind of full swing, because that position cannot be fully kind of replaced by the locals. So the need for foreign workers is so evident economically. So that this is something that must be kind of put on front in discussing kind of concerted effort between governments of sending and receiving countries. I think that's my first response on your question. Thank you.
How about John? Based on your study, any thing that you can share on how governments across the region have responded?
Yeah, sure. So I'll just give a few examples. Just before I do that, I just want to just something, and I think you just touched upon this, Gunther there. The difference that you see between temporary migrant flows, where people are moving back, and those permanent diaspora, I think that's also being complemented by the sort of the extreme shortage of labour at the moment. And as borders are starting to open up now, so it's just happening here in Australia. No, it's been happening in the UK and the US. There's a lot of sort of, you know, particularly white collar medical professionals and so on that are kind of coming back in. Where there is desperate need. So that obviously, that has so even though the numbers of people may be less effectively, that's obviously having a disproportionate impact on the higher flows. So I think that's going to be, interesting to see. I guess Europe, with what we're seeing there with the fourth wave, might be sort of somewhat delayed in the impact there, but certainly other parts of the world, as their sort of restrictions ease, that sort of gap is going to be filled and it's going to have a significant positive impact. So just to look at a few insights here on what we saw in the region here. So, sorry, just bear with me one moment. I think just to give you some examples here in Bangladesh, they were providing incentives to help to get people to be using formal remittance channels. There's many corridors, they often have informal services. So, this was important, and this appears to have had a significant impact. They also instructed mobile financial service providers to offer free cash outs. Up to 1,000 taka. But and then also ensured that the monthly limit for money transfers through mobile services could increase. So obviously this helped to encourage flows coming back into providers. I'm sure Bcash would have lots of data as well that would go to sort of support that too. With Philippines, I mentioned the Phil Pass fee waiving earlier. Obviously that's continuing to 2021. The central bank worked closely there to really encourage remittance fees to be waived for overseas providers. Pakistan was again very much focused on sort of encouraging digital remittances and So they were again changing the threshold, making it more possible to get more money back. So, for example, changing it going down. So rather than having to send $200 as a transaction, sending $100, that obviously opened up more flows for smaller values. And then looking in the Pacific, a lot of what we saw there was central bank support for the deployment and growth of digital remittances. So there's been huge growth in mobile remittances in most countries, especially Fiji. And sorry, just bear with me here. Yeah, and also I think and this came across as a general theme through the work. Many central banks and reserve banks classified financial services as essential, including remittance services. So even though on the send side it was often difficult for a customer to go to a physical location, on the receive side there was there was basically they were trying to find any way possible to ensure the money could come in. So either allowing sort of making exemptions for banks and money exchange houses, foreign exchange dealers, or the sort of aforementioned mobile support. So that's just a few examples there, what we saw with the IOM work. I think just beyond that, I think that there's broader sort of focus now on developing policy that's encouraging transparency in markets. So this is something that we're kind of I've been seeing across Asia Pacific. We see this another sort of area that I'm involved with. We manage a website called Saver Asia, which provides remittance cost and service information for Asian migrant workers. So obviously we've kind of got our ear to the ground as things are developing and evolving. So there's been a lot of work that's been taken place. Of course, ADB directly supporting some of this with that aspect, such as much more migrant worker friendly KYC initiatives and broader sort of KYC systems to sort of help to try and alleviate the pressure from de-risking. So some of these activities were already sort of evolving and underway before COVID, but it sort of feels that there's been I guess what might have happened in over 5 years is sort of happening in 1 to 2 years in many of these countries. Okay.
Thanks, John. Yeah, that's good. This is a good transition to how the private sector can help. Right. You talked about the financial sector lowering fees. Now, in your studies, Aiko or John, what is being done by the private sector in supporting our migrant workers, particularly those in the lower end? Because I think for the highly skilled, it was easier for them to shift right to digital platform, but then for the low skill, then how can the private sector help? Thank you.
Maybe I could start. So if John could touch more on the remittance side, maybe I could work more from the recruiter side. So from the origin countries, it's the recruiter who plays a crucial role in facilitating mobility to the overseas. Some of the report on the return that I read suggests that recruiters were a bit helpless when it comes to helping migrants return home. Many have returned home with the government support. They have the charter flight and return like millions of workers, for example, in case of India. But recruiters have played very little role. I believe that the recruiters have, in some countries, have been a little bit more conscious of some of the ethical standard by not charging fee or that not charging excess fee. However, it really exposes that despite the fact that the recruiters are the one who has the most interaction with migrant workers, they are a little bit helpless once crisis happens. So the take from this is that making recruiters and / also the recruiters at the destination or the employers set more clear responsibilities of these the intermediaries when crisis happened. I think that wasn't really taken into account in the various scenarios, like crisis scenarios, but this really exposes it. Government have sort of, since the Gulf War, they have been accustomed to organizing this mass return, but that's about it. But they could have been much more support. For example, recruiter would maybe able to place the workers to another employer without returning. There are a lot of things that these recruiters could have played, but they sort of watched it from the country of origin to let it unfold. So I believe that recruiters could play a little bit more role, or that in the licensing procedures could put more responsibilities or liabilities so that they could play, and they're forced to play a good role in protecting migrants.
James, I'm just wondering, in your study, was there like a classification by type of job? And then somehow, how is the private sector responding to that specific sector?
In the GTAP model, in the GMIG model, actually, we were looking at 6 skills classification, but we lumped them into skilled and unskilled. Unfortunately, in the model, we don't have a private sector in terms of the supply side. But I think I agree with Aiko. I think the main role of the private sector is actually to try to reduce the cost associated with outbound migration, because what this shock has done is it has imposed a shock on both the supply and the demand side of outbound migration, because both destinations and origin countries are affected. So to the extent that they could actually improve the process to lower the cost of outbound migration, and also I think advocate lowering the cost of sending remittance would actually be a good policy on a macro level to try to enhance the recovery of outbound migration. Just one comment, Dulce, not on the private sector, but on the policy. One policy I think that was really crucial in 2020 and 2021, and which could be a risk in 2022, is the role of fiscal stimulus. Because when we look at the recovery in terms of the projection for Asia, 60% of the remittance recovery are actually coming from the US, UK, and EU. These are actually advanced economies with very large fiscal stimulus. And then another 30% of the recovery in remittance is coming from Middle East. These are actually also very rich in economies which have provided a large stimulus. But we are actually expecting that in 2022, this fiscal stimulus will be unwound. So my question is, what risk does this unwinding of fiscal stimulus, which was present in 2020 and 21, affect remittance inflow to Asia in 2022? That's it from my side.
Okay, thank you, James. How about John? Did you want to say something earlier?
I can't remember what I was going to say earlier, but just in direct response to what James was just saying there, this is something, this unwinding, as you say, is going to have potentially an impact in 2022, especially if we see any spikes. I'm just looking at my neighbourhood here in Australia, New Zealand. Of course, there was a lot of government fiscal support. If we end up having a gamma wave or whatever the next one may be, this is the money there to support in such a way again. And I think there's obviously, you can see in the UK right now that they've been reducing the furlough scheme, resisting calls to bring it back despite the high continuing high case numbers and so on. So there is an issue there. There's certainly, though, there's obviously on the positive basis, you've got, like, when you're looking at like temporary migrant worker programs such as in the Pacific, the Pacific labour schemes, as the borders are now reopening, that they can reopen. Those flows will, that like the kind of more the sort of permanent sort of diaspora flows are going to be supplemented again by higher flows, and there's been a desperate need to have those seasonal workers coming into Australia and New Zealand. I know as well. I'm sure that Thailand, for example, is going to be is going to be crying out for labour next year as the borders open again, and suddenly the tourism flocks back, or the economy ratchets up to full potential. So I think this is something we sort of touched upon in the Lao work recently, is the sort of need to use this time now to develop more training for workers, so both financial literacy but also skills training for workers, so that once the time comes to sort of when basically when the doors open again, that everybody's going back and they're even better equipped to deal with working abroad again.
Okay. Yeah. Apart from what James mentioned earlier about fiscal stimulus, possibility of going down next year. Of course, unemployment is a big issue for many of our countries in the region. Now, Guntur mentioned earlier about collaboration. What do you think is the role of regional cooperation in this case, and how James mentioned about labor mobility are slower than the trades goods trade mobility, whatever you say it. But then, yeah, what is the role of a regional cooperation in this case, Guntur? Thank you. You're on mute, Guntur. Not yet. Still on mute. Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
Actually, the role of the policy action at the regional level or regional cooperation is very critical in some stage. And luckily, there are some already kind of platform for kind of facilitating the skill mobility within regional context. So this is something that must be kind of maximized among the countries involved. Can I just mention the call for reducing placement or recruitment fees? That call actually is already in the context of facing increasing migration costs at the moment, because there's so many migrants returning from the red countries like Pakistan, like Indonesia, like many other countries. Sometimes they cannot go directly to the destination countries. In some cases, they must go to the third, even fourth countries before able to enter the actual final destination countries. And in the process, they must also undergo kind of many quarantine, which actually very costly. So all of those costs that should be kind of bear in mind, that should be considered in the context of us suggesting to reduce the recruitment fees on the kind of migration cost overall. This is something that we need to ask for kind of more commitment from the recruitment that I mentioned, so that the role of business in that migration context should be kind of strengthened and clarified. Not all of the costs should be borne by the government in that sense. Okay. That's second. On the kind of specific regional collaboration that I'm thinking of, there's in ASEAN, for instance, they already have some kind of specific collaboration among professional groups that can be exploited. For instance, among the ASEAN architect, ASEAN accountant, ASEAN engineer, all of those things. The professional group can provide some kind of additional facilitation so that workers in that categories can move much more freely across the countries, because their qualification especially and for the guaranteeing that they are not going to be the virus spreader. Actually, the current system of pre-testing before departure and on arrival, all of those things can be combined directly with the regular testing in the kind of working area. This is already done in UK when I was there, so that the containment of migrant workers to prevent them to become a virus spreader, it can be really contained, so that there's kind of real kind of bubble channel between migrants from the destination, from the home to destination country. This actually can be well established. So that's something that regional collaboration can be kind of frame about. Second is about the vaccination. we know that every country is in different faction, right? And then some countries actually doesn't want to accept different kind of vaccine. So vaccine, so that if you are vaccinated using different vaccine, they as if the kind of destination country going to force you to have kind of revaccination of the one that accepted. This is something which must be resolved as soon as possible, because at the end, vaccination passport should be accepted, and then if there is kind of discrepancy on the level of efficacy, that can be complemented with kind of regular testing at the kind of arrival point, at the working station point, whatever points that the kind of destination country happy. So that is something that must be kind of discussed, must be established at regional and global level. And this is really up to the government to do that, because you cannot expect migrant to negotiate that kind of thing to the government. Thank you.
Thank you. I think one thing that we haven't touched on right now would be the role of technology, in pushing for remittances or supporting remittances. Now, what can you say, or how can technology be an enabler, particularly in the recovery period? John, any project that you've worked on that you can share with us?
Yeah, so I think clearly the sort of expansion and growth of digital channels is having, a profound impact. I think the latest data, I can't remember the figures, but the remittance price worldwide data just came out this week for Q2, and that shows a substantially lower tracking of digital remittance costs, which is not really a surprise, I guess, but I think there's to go with that, and this is, I guess, one project that we're involved with is so Saver Asia, as I mentioned before. So what we're doing there is it's all about educating migrants about all the different services. So we're trying to while we cover everything, obviously we're trying to encourage adoption of low-cost services, and those are of course often digital. So part of what we're doing is educating people about how to use digital services, working with fintechs and or sometimes large incumbent MTOs, money transfer operators, and banks, to try and find ways in which we can sort of simplify the education around what their services are, so that migrants that might not necessarily have a great deal of digital literacy, let alone financial literacy, can understand that there is better solutions. And coupled with that, whilst not remittance focused, what we're also doing here is providing education and information about financial services that are going to benefit the receivers as well. So for example, microfinance institutions where you can mobile wallets that may be connected to microfinance operations in receive countries. I think in terms of we've still got the kind of spectre of de-risking, which is it's sort of a major impact, sort of impediment on just how low remittance costs can go, because when you speak to many people in the industry, they'll say, look, we'd be happy to reduce costs and to put money towards education about the lower cost services, but we've got so much of our budget has to go on compliance. And this is something that, as we know, in Australia and New Zealand has been, many years now, nearly a decade. Also Europe and the US, of course. So this continues to have a problem, and even the sort of more advanced big fintechs such as Nuam, the Singapore and India operation, they're facing it, and they're a unicorn. so it's something that is having like that is something, I guess, sort of the will and desire is there from the industry, but they're kind of restricted in some locations by what they can do. So what we're trying to do anyway with Saver Asia, and also with similar platforms around the world such as Saver Africa, is basically trying to find a way where we can provide the information to the migrants and their families in language, in simple terms, to help provide that education and kind of provide another sort of marketing outlet really for these new lower cost services, make people aware of them. I think aside from that, there's, we've seen that there has been, some sort of quite interesting ways in which services, like for example, BRAC, the Bangladesh service, they really tried to encourage adoption of mobile wallets. And they supported families last year with digital cash grants. I think it was $13 million. And this was sort of provided to mobile wallets. So obviously that's both helping remittance receivers during a time of crisis, but also in the same process, helping to increase adoption. So I think where that's possible, that's a great way that the private sector can help to accelerate adoption, not just focusing on the sender, but also on the receiver as well. Okay.
Thanks, John. I'm glad that you mentioned about helping or assisting the families of the migrant workers as well, not just focusing on the migrant workers. Now, I'll go to Aiko first because she raised her hand first. Go ahead, Aiko. You'd like to share something, and then James. Thank you.
Thank you. So, beginning of this year, together with ILO, OECD, and we have done sort of a evaluation of what we call a MIG-tech, migration-related technology, and we found that, for example, overwhelming majority of migrants would have mobile phone, like approximately about 90%, and some study would suggest that perhaps up to 60% would have a smartphone, and that strikes a much greater opportunity to use this platform for others to facilitate migration and make the migration process development oriented in the host in the origin countries. So maybe I can send the link to this publication to this group. But for example, we looked at how technology can improve access to information, not just for the migrant, but information to match employers and migrants. We know that now they're using this digital platform to interview migrants and so on, which really bridges a lot of information asymmetry that would cause a lot of issues when migrants land in the destination countries. It also helps migrants protect their rights. Some of the like the reporting app would help migrant report if there's any case of abuse. Some employer would actively take this kind of application and embed in their factories or other workplace so that workers can report any incidences. And also, there's no doubt that this migration have helped migrant family communicate each other and make better decision about the use of remittances. They will be able to communicate more frequently, and that really seem to have contributed to some cases economic empowerment, and that in fact we are very interested in looking at this role of technology that can really facilitate the joint decision of migrant and recipient families of the remittances to make this migration experience more development oriented and the remittance being spent on more productive means. So we're hoping to do a little bit more research on this as we go forward. Thank you.
Interesting, Aiko. I just remembered that I've been told that they're using the TikTok platform in terms of hiring people. And I don't know how it goes. But then, like if you're applying to be, let's say, in the hotel industry, right? They will check how you carry yourself, which is effective because you can see actually how the person can behave. Now let's go to James. James, what can you say?
Same. I think this is actually quite consistent with what Aiko is saying. In general, I think digital technology plays two roles. One, because of its efficiency, it can actually enhance a lot of efficiency in terms of processes related to outbound migration or processes related to sending remittances. It can lower the cost. But as what Aiko said, the second channel actually is digital technology creates information. And what happened during this pandemic is there's large information asymmetry, one in terms of the healthiness of workers, second in terms of the vaccination of workers. There are also information asymmetry in terms of travel restrictions or travel protocols, or even border restrictions and border protocols. So I think the role of technology is actually to ensure that these information are available in a common platform across countries, right? So for example, you have to have health records of migrant workers captured digitally and linked to their passports and accessible in a common format across countries and region. Now, of course, there will be differences between standards in Europe, in North America, and Asia. And probably what we should actually focus is first harmonizing the regulations, harmonizing the standards in the region in Asia, because what we know is that travel, long haul travel, will actually not happen anytime soon. It's the short haul travel which will probably happen. The second one is, and this is actually quite concerning because we know that the pandemic has also become an opportunity for syndicates to come up with human trafficking, especially women. And this is actually a sad part. We've seen this, that anytime there's a disaster, a natural man-made disaster, the trafficking of women and young children actually increase. And sometimes they are disguised as migration. So I think this has been reported in many countries in the region in Southeast Asia, and I think using app to track this, because this is really a poor outcome. And as Aiko said, violence against migrant workers, in particular women, there has been an increase reported, especially in the Middle East. And I think the use of digital technology to make sure that this crime doesn't happen is quite essential. Thank you, Dulce.
Thank you, James. Yes, Guntur, anything you'd like to add?
Just exactly linked to what just James said. Actually, the current application is already somehow already been used by kind of business. This has happened to me when information about that I got infected by the virus. Actually, the Emirates been informed by the UK government that I'm not allowed to go outside the country until a certain date, until all of my kind of observation of the virus is completed. So this is something kind of surprised me, because we already more or less kind of have some idea to go earlier, but then the Emirates actually suggested us to postpone the flight, and then to make sure that I'm free of virus when I'm traveling. So this kind of information about the vaccination passport, and then the virus infection, and all of the health information can actually be combined with information about the job, about the kind of work of the migrants, so that the idea of promoting a more transparent, safe, and kind of manageable kind of migration can be helped by these apps that currently ongoing. This is something which kind of naturally relatively easily done. So I hope the government can see this as an opportunity to make the open and transparent migration is kind of reality soon. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Guntur. Now, one thing that I find interesting is that so many of the workers have gone back to their countries, right? And this is an opportunity for the country to tap their potential because in most cases they have been trained well, right? And it provides an opportunity for the government to enhance, let's say, the labor force. Now, what do you think can ADB do or other international organizations in helping governments if they're not able to go back to their country destinations? How can we help them, nurture them, instead of lose the skills that they have already mastered or acquired from other countries? Yes, James.
Yes, I think Dulce, you've actually touched on a very important point, because one inflow that's not actually seen in this migration area is actually the inflow of social capital, because migrants, when they come back to their countries, they bring with them their experience, their new knowledge, and their new way of thinking. And we have seen in the Philippines that there are many stories of migrants going into startup business, new businesses, because they've lost jobs. And I think the government's role here is actually to develop the business ecosystem to provide the support, both in terms of advisory, both in terms of providing seed capital if needed, or some form of training. Because I think there could be permanent impact on migration because some sectors, like for example, cruise ships, no, will probably take time to recover, and those migrant workers in the shipping industry, especially in the cruise ship industry, need to actually adapt to this new normal. And providing the ecosystem, providing a one-stop shop to provide them with training, capital, as well as support services will be essential. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, James. Yes, Aiko?
Thank you. If you look at the report on the return, depending on the country, but if you ask returnee, what is your plan in the next few months once they return? I think like 30 to 70%. That's the report I've seen so far in the various countries. So up to as low as 30, but as much as 70% of the returnee wish that they would go back to the countries that they worked, and they continue to work. And of course, the percentage are higher if they're from OECD countries or with the better amenities and so on. But that's the reality, and that's what really prompted them to migrate to start. The conditions of not being able to find. So I don't think we can be too optimistic about the reintegration effort, but it doesn't mean that we should give up on it. The study does show that the well-prepared migration with some goal setting helps migrants have only defined period of migration and return and invest as planned, so that they do not have to prolong the migration even if they don't wish to, but have a steady plan of saving and invest and return by the time they retire or when their kids would graduate from the schools and so on. So I cannot overstress the importance of preparation rather than, okay, here comes the worker return, what do? We need to have a much better pre-departure to during migration training on financial inclusions, better communication with their families, and help support migrant invest in good opportunities in the long term. So this really is not just about responding to the returnees and what to do, not to do, but more long-term perspective and how origin country can be prepared to use the migration opportunities for the families and for the countries that really promote development.
I agree with that, Aiko. It's not just for the returning, but we also have to bear in mind, like given the requirements for health workers in other countries, what would be the impact in the near term, right? So the governments have to have a plan for that. Yes, John, you raised your hand.
Yeah, just to give a couple of examples of the work that we've been doing exactly about this sort of pre-departure space. So with Save Asia, that's partly supported by the ILO Triangle and ASEAN project. And we've been, obviously, this is some of our plans for pre-departure training have been taken significant delays because of COVID. But we will shortly be doing training in Cambodia with ILO and with the National Employment Agency. So basically, as people are getting their sort of pre-departure briefings or finding out about employment opportunities, they'll also get the chance to learn about have some remittances and financial literacy training. So this will help us to both to navigate Save Asia as a service, but also more broadly kind of giving sort of guidance on different remittance products, the benefits of understanding sort of key financial finance basics, financial tips, understanding how to budget. In certain countries, like for example in Malaysia, there's a specific overtime regulations, making sure that migrants understand how we through ILO support, we have this information available to understand how to calculate this and make sure that they're getting paid appropriately from their employers. So that's just work that's starting to take place in Cambodia, and then we're also doing work with them in Malaysia and Thailand, dependent upon the political situation, potentially in Myanmar as well. So for example, in Malaysia, that's not so much pre-departure, that's sort of working with the migrants when they've arrived and through migrant resource centres and sort of furthering that education and training. With IOM in the Pacific, the program we've been working on there is is a bit more extensive in terms of the modules and so on. It includes topics such as cybersecurity. People who who may have never lived and worked abroad. They may have only have the smartphone for the first time that year. There's obviously a whole world of of information that they need to sort of take in and understand in simple terms. And then, again, introducing sort of budgeting techniques and, and understanding digital remittance services, the benefits for receivers, opening mobile wallets and so on. So that work is just being rolled out now in Tonga, Tuvalu and Vanuatu. And it's, I mean, it's can be fairly adaptable for other regions, of course, as well. So, it'd be great to see that sort of taking place elsewhere. So that's just some sort of work we're involved with. I'm obviously aware that there's other pre-departure work that takes place as well. But, it's something that is, it's hopefully as restrictions alleviate, there's more opportunity for people to take on this training before they depart. Okay.
Thanks, John. Okay, maybe we can proceed first with Guntur and then we'll go to the question in the chat box. Guntur, go ahead.
I just would like to add a kind of very nice point from Aiko regarding the difficult things in reintegration, because this is one aspect that we must kind of understood properly. This is a kind of issue of supply side actually. Second aspect that we must also understand properly is that we cannot just give additional finance support to the kind of migrants to make them become entrepreneur or something, to make them start business, that kind of thing. There's so many illusions regarding that. As if we are giving them a kind of capital so they can establish a new business, blah, 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 etc. If they have the entrepreneurship from the beginning, they might be already done. So before they kind of going abroad. So this is something that government sometimes is kind of have a very myopic and short view regarding the migrants. If the migrant can save their money and then government can provide additional funding so they can become a kind of new entrepreneur, establishing new business, blah, blah, blah. That's failure on that aspect, so many of them already. So this is something that must be bear in our mind in reintegration. Reintegration is very difficult because what the migrant need is access to job, not access to finance or other things. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Guntur. Now, a question here is there a risk that employment opportunities for foreign-born workers in destination economies such as Middle East or US, UK, EU decline? Also, growing negative sentiment for foreign-born workers when jobs are scant. So anything who'd like to comment on that? Yes, Aiko.
Thank you. So I could maybe talk about the Middle East and possibly in the case of some of the Asian countries, even though it's not listed there. So for the Middle East, even before the COVID, there was a drive to sort of nationalize workforce because of the high unemployment rate among youth of the Middle East countries. And that has resulted in significant reduction of the contract given to foreign workers to start with. Then comes the COVID. So in terms of the Middle East, except for some of the essential workers like domestic workers, medical workers, I do not expect a lot of growth in the Middle East if this nationalization drive would continue and go on for a while. In terms of Asia, for example, Japan just announced that some of the categories of the semi-skilled workers would get the unbound visa, meaning they can extend as many years as possible. There's no restrictions on it. So that would include some of the sectors like construction or care work. So care work is actually already in, but then there will be more additional work that would be going into it. So for the country that are aging and that will be experiencing gradual reduction of the workforce, it's really evident that the demand would continue and potentially grow. So I think different trends would prevail, but it's not too pessimistic at this point.
Okay, Thank you, Aiko, for an overview. Now, I'd like to invite our participants for any comments or questions or you'd like to share from your region. Please go ahead. You can raise your hand or you just unmute yourselves. Okay, while we're waiting for that, in the interest of time, can I just ask our panelists, what key messages you'd like to share with us as we close the webinar? Something that, could be food for thought or something that you would wish our countries or governments would do in order to protect and promote resilience of remittances. Please go ahead. Maybe we can start with James.
Thank you, Dulce. I think the parting message from myself is that from the simulation that we've done, what we've seen is that remittance, outbound migration and remittance inflows have been quite resilient in 2020 and 2021. But I think there are risks. There are risks on the horizon that the situation may not actually be too positive in the medium term. One, I think because of possible reemergence of I think the gamma or the omega variant of the COVID. Second is unwounding of fiscal stimulus. Third is possible decline in employment opportunities for foreign-born workers. So I think governments in the sending economies and receiving economies should work together to really provide the essential support to migrant workers and their families. Thank you.
How about John?
Thank you. Yeah, look, I think there's two areas I want to look at here. So one, I think, is is governments providing more support in terms of education and information campaigns. So focusing both on remittance senders and the families. There's, in terms of the technology, there is when it comes to reducing remittance costs and improving livelihoods through digital finance, it's there. It exists in many countries, and there's, for example, there's mobile wallets often in some of the most remote locations in source countries. It does need to be more reinforcement of training and this and like also kind of public advocacy campaigns and so on to raise this. I can think. I mean, I know Cambodia has been very, very strong in this in recent years. With kind of government cross society campaigns, and obviously that's had a profound impact now with the adoption of mobile wallets there. I think more broadly than that, and this is sort of aligning with what we're talking about here, as I think with the risks to migrants, returning home. I think there also needs to be more focus on training for returning workers. Both recognizing returning skill sets. So if I look at like the Mekong example, many migrants who are returning to Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos are coming back often with skills that that place them in quite a unique and beneficial position for society. But so I think kind of connecting employers with these returning migrants, making them aware of the opportunity. There's a role there for international organisations. I know IOM are involved with this, kind of supporting this. But it's this is a long-term requirement to sort of train returning migrants and provide more opportunities to ensure that they've got future potential, both for when they potentially can work abroad, but also within their origin economy.
Thanks, John. How about Aiko?
Sure. Calling from the message of our brief, which would come out very soon, we can take this opportunity to really address some of the weakness that we have already known for the migration governance and the system. And Gunther has highlighted a very important point about the sort of a passive mode of some of the origin country. Whatever the destination country say, their visa policy say, we just follow and try to adapt. Maybe it's a good opportunity that while destination country also recognizes their demand for workers, it's good time to review existing policies and to to update it, with or without COVID, and to negotiate well to bring more efficiency or transparency to the system. And to do this, the role of a regional cooperation cannot be overstressed. Organization like IOM or ILO has been very active, bringing destination country and the origin country as a mix of group of country to discuss and negotiate some of the minimum standard of the right of the migrants or the procedures of safely deploying workers. So those efforts can be strengthened, and really needing at this critical moment like this to make some consensus. So I know ADB is also working on this area through its regional cooperation team to bring countries of origin and destination together to negotiate. I think those efforts are critical at this point.
Okay. Thank you, Aiko. And finally, let's hear from Guntur.
Guntur, you're muted.
Sorry again. My main takeaway from the situation is that in the future, the country, the sending country dependence on the migration and remittance is going to increase. Why? Because of two sides. First, because of their economy is not getting better because of the COVID. Because the COVID actually exploit their kind of fundamental issue as well as fiscal issue, blah, blah, blah. So in the end, their economic situation is not better than prior to the COVID. So this is going to increase their dependence on migration and remittance. This is something that we must kind of take into account. Secondly, migrant workers themselves is going to face a much more difficult challenge because of the health protocol, because of the security protocols, all of those things. So the two actually calling for much more kind of better facilitation. When I say better facilitation, is really significantly improved facilitation for migration and remittance. This is something that I can just mention now, but this can be much more detailed and much kind of specific policy action. Because without that, we cannot expect that the role of migration and remittance will remain like before. Why? Because this crisis is really unprecedented. So this is huge global long crisis that require kind of significant action from the sending as well as receiving countries. So that's my kind of final message or final thought from me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And with that, we'd like to thank all our panelists, our guests, and everyone who have attended for joining this webinar. I hope it has been an enriching afternoon with you. For you. And we all say that remittances are a lifeline of many people in Asia and the Pacific, and we hope that we continue to help the governments and everyone else, the private sector, in order to protect this sector. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
you. Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Guntur.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
Aiko.
you.
Thank you. Nice.
Very-
Very nice. Dulce, we need to do we need to do the spotlight, the highlights.
Yes.
We should ask probably 3 messages from Guntur, John, and Aiko so that we